Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Industrial Heating Equipment Association and our Government Relations Committee, thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the Department of Defense Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, presented by Jason Floyd and Kane McGladrey with Ascent Solutions. The goal of this webinar, which is exclusively for our IHEA members, is to help you learn how to adjust your strategy to be ready for CMMC 2.0. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that all attendees are on mute, so if you have any questions along the way, please type them in the question panel. The speakers will address the questions at the end of the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Jason Floyd is the Senior Manager, Director, and CTO for Cybersecurity at Ascent. Jason leads enterprises to secure, unify, and manage their Microsoft solutions. Prior to earning a Master of Science in Security Technologies from the University of Minnesota, Jason dedicated 9 years of full-time service to the United States Marine Corps. During his service, he served as the cyber warfare subject matter expert at the Marine Weapons School. Jason's military background and enterprise consulting experience come together in a unique blend of highly technical security acumen with a business-centric approach. He's a proven security technologist and cybersecurity architect for multiple highly regulated industries, including government, financial services, healthcare, and manufacturing. Kane McGladrey is a cybersecurity strategist at Ascent Solutions. Kane has been providing strategic cybersecurity consulting for Global 1000 companies for over 2 decades, and his work has been featured in Security Magazine, Popular Science, CIO Online, Becker's Hospital Review, FedTech Magazine, Network World, ZDNet, Dark Reading, and more. Kane and Jason, welcome and thank you.
Thanks for having us on today. And I want to thank everyone for taking their time on a Friday morning to attend this webinar. As Kelly said, we'll take questions towards the end. Jason will be monitoring the chat for me and might have a chance to pose questions as we go. But today we're talking about how the CMMC 2.0 is going to potentially affect your business. And if you've been tracking this space for some time, you know that the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, the CMMC, initially rolled out in 2019. But then there was a substantial amount of congressional, public, and industry comment that was received. And as a result, the Department of Defense announced CMMC 2.0 just back in last year, actually, in November 2021. And the reason that you're here today on our webinar is because you're selling systems and components, and that could be either directly or via a prime, into the various branches covered by the Department of Defense. And you might have also heard about forthcoming contractual requirements for CMMC that would require that your business get a certification level in order to continue with your sales. But CMMC is pretty new, right? We're talking November 2019, and honestly, it had already been difficult to predict exactly how CMMC 1.0 could have affected all of the businesses in the defense industrial base. And you know, we're all used to working with some ambiguity in business, but having an entirely new set of regulatory requirements can make long-term strategic planning and business development planning really difficult. And for you to continue to prosper, you really want to know what the CMMC 2.0 requires and to be certain, or, well, as certain as we can be, about how the CMMC 2.0 is going to affect your organization, because that way you can plan despite any uncertainty. And in today's presentation, we're going to talk about just that, how to change your strategies in advance of CMMC 2 so that you're able to navigate through this period of uncertainty and be well prepared to defend against modern cyber threats. So the CMMC 2.0 defines 3 levels of maturity. Now today, we're just going to talk about levels 1 and levels 2, as level 3 is going to be primarily around those prime and subs that are developing weapon systems and weapons platforms. The other thing is the DOD and the CMMC Accreditation Board are currently focused on fully defining CMMC level 1 and level 2 right now, so level 3 is still not fully defined. So as we start our talk today, let's talk about how CMMC level 1 could affect your business. And if you know right now that you currently handle federal contract information, FCI, you're going to at least be at level 1 of the CMMC. Now, the first consideration for CMMC Level 1 is that there's 17 controls in scope. And like all controls, you can think of these as being incorporating people and process and technology that are going to mitigate a risk identified by the business. Now, in this case, the overall theme is to raise the cybersecurity of organizations in the defense industrial based supply chain. Now, if you're tracking CMMC 1.0, the good news here is that the 17 controls, they haven't changed. They're just as applicable to systems that store or process or transmit federal contract information. That's that FCI. And FCI covers nearly everything you receive from the prime or the sub after you sign a contract, except if you're receiving documents that are marked with a different marking, like CUI or CDI or another label. And the main takeaway out of those 17 controls, they're pretty reasonable, right? You should know, for example, who's logging into your computers, and you should have some kind of anti-malware or antivirus solution on your computers. Those are actually pretty easy to understand. And all of those controls map back to FAR 52-204-21, which for all of us isn't really a new contractual requirement. Where things get a little more interesting is around physical controls for FCI. If you have a computer with FCI on it, it's ideally protected both digitally as well as physically, so somebody can't just walk off with the computer. But the same rationale applies for paper too, right? If you're printing out documents that are FCI, CMMC requires that you'd have those documents stored and handled in a location where only other people who are authorized to view or handle FCI can access those documents. And for some businesses, this is going to feel odd, right? If you've got an open floor plan office, this would mean you need to have a room, and there'd have to be a door, and there'd have to be a lock on the door where all the FCI is being handled. But if you've been working with the DOD for years, this isn't going to feel too odd if you've been following the FAR requirements that are really the basis of CMMC 2.0 Level 1. The other primary consideration for CMMC Level 1 is that it's about being able to perform the required controls. And for smaller organizations, that means you don't necessarily need to have voluminous policy documents or procedure documents. Those would admittedly help, particularly if you think about onboarding new staff so that they have a reference on how to do things. But procedure documentation isn't a hard requirement for CMMC Level 1. So the main goal, as I said, of CMMC Level 1 is around protecting FCI by applying specific controls. And some of those controls, like I said, antivirus, make a lot of sense for the whole company. If you're on a computer that has FCI, or if you're on the accounting computer, or if you're on an HR computer, I think we can all agree antivirus is, generally speaking, a good idea. But some of the other controls, particularly around east-west network traffic, tend to make a lot less sense for a blended commercial and governmental company. And our finding has been that to make it as easy as possible is to set up a dedicated enclave for FCI, which will limit your scope of changes and the associated cost of those changes to an organization. Now, the easiest way to think about an enclave is like a fence. And you take all of your assets that store, process, or transmit FCI, you put them inside of that fence. And it's a logic model. And there's an illustration shown on screen here. But in this logical model, we've carved out a dedicated zone for FCI. Now, that doesn't need to be dedicated physical machines and dedicated cables. You could virtualize the whole thing. The main point of this model is that your normal company computers that don't contain FCI, like the HR computers, or maybe your sales computers, or maybe the ones that your engineers that are working on projects that aren't governmental in nature, right? Those are in Zone 6, enterprise-wide security. And all of the security tools, all the networking technologies, all the infrastructure that supports those computers and those devices that do have FCI in that Zone 1 area, you keep those as separate as possible from your normal computers. And there's a couple advantages to an enclave strategy. The biggest one here is that if your organization has a cyber attack, threat actors are going to have a really hard time getting to the federal contract information because It's not stored on your normal computers, and it's generally not accessible to your normal computers. But this is also a protection against legal risk, because you'd be following a very reasonable approach to securing FCI. Enclaves were actually specifically mentioned as solutions in some of the first CMMC documents. Done right, an enclave where all the FCI are stored, processed, and transmitted is a pretty defensible approach. Now, there is one catch. If your only client is the DoD and their associated branches, that approach isn't a requirement of having an enclave, because you'd be required to apply all 17 controls across all of your computers and across all of your offices in order to achieve CMMC level 1. So let's say, for example, your organization, let's say, exclusively produce and cut various types of sheet metal and maybe carbon for a prime under a contract with the DoD. Well, you're probably on CMMC level 1 because you're cutting metal to a specification. Because if the prime is doing things correctly, all you've got is a contract and some specifications. You don't actually know where the metal is going or why it's that size. All you know is contract says cut the metal, you send the metal to them, done. That's FCI. That's probably a CMMC level 1 requirement. One of the other substantial changes that we saw in CMMC 1.0, the older version, to 2.0, is that CMMC 2 requires that organizations conduct an annual self-assessment, and that a senior company officer submits the results of that self-assessment annually while your organization has one or more contracts with CMMC level 1 requirements. Now, the CMMC level 1 self-assessment guide came out in December of 2021, and it has a companion scoping guide. And an interesting point here is the scoping guide states that because FCI is a broad category of information, it says it's likely the assessment scope is going to cover the entire organization. Now, that's probably true if you're not using an enclave strategy, or if you're a smaller organization that doesn't use some other type of segmentation, like based on lines of business or based on products or based on programs that you're supporting. There's also some ambiguity right now in that self-assessment guide. And this is one where we're looking for a ruling on, probably out of the DoD, because it's not yet clear what senior company officer is. It seems kind of obvious, but nobody's come up and said it has to be the CFO, or it has to be the CIO, or it has to be the CEO. Nobody's said that yet. So it's not quite clear who's going to submit those self-assessment results. And that's really just a consequence of CMMC 2.0 being as new as it is. And once there's formal guidance on that, we anticipate the DoD is going to release those details. Again, it's worth mentioning though, these aren't new controls, right? So if you've been doing FAR 52, 204, 21, you don't have any new risks from an enforcement standard, right? We expect that the government is going to continue with enforcement via the False Claims Act, and that would happen if a company has a breach and there's a material difference between the controls that you've self-reported and self-assessed compared to how they've been implemented, but only if there's an external investigation. So that's CMMC level 1. It's really foundational cybersecurity. And there weren't any new controls. So I want to spend some more time talking about CMMC level 2. CMMC level 2 is defined as advanced cybersecurity. And in most cases, this is going to actually affect your business in either a smaller or a larger way. And again, we're not talking about CMMC level 3 yet because it's just not done yet. When it does arrive though, if you're producing weapon systems or supporting platforms, that's for you. But right now, if you know your business currently handles controlled unclassified information, CUI, or sometimes what people call CUI, you'll be at least at level 2 of the CMMC. Now, the primary requirement of CMMC level 2 is that there's 110 controls. That's a big jump, right? Because in CMMC level 1, we said we had 17 controls. In CMMC level 2, we've got 110 controls. It's a big step up right there. But the good thing is that they aren't new controls. CMMC level 2 is based on NIST 800-171, which we've had for many years now. And CMMC level 2 doesn't really define or require any initial controls beyond what's in NIST 800-171 R2. So if you've already been doing self-assessments under NIST 800-171, you're familiar with this. If you're not, the main thing here is in CMMC, in the self-assessment guide, they mentioned that you should use a companion document called NIST 800-171A. That's one of those wrinkles here when we're doing a CMMC level 2 assessment, is you'll look at the 110 controls and then how to assess them. That's in that separate document, NIST 800-171A. We also do anticipate that because of that confusion that's happening right now, there is going to be a new NIST 800-171 coming out this year, and that there may be some additional determinations made around controls in that revision, but we don't have a full read on that yet out of NIST. But if you're thinking, wait, you just said NIST 800-171, I've heard this before, right? We've all been required to have these controls in place since 2017, right? If you all remember DFARS, that's when they said you have to use NIST 800-171. Those are the same controls we've been doing self-assessments on when we submitted our results under the DOD Supplier Performance Risk System. Many of us would also know that as SPRS, right? So if you already know your SPRS score, you already know you're doing this. If you aren't familiar with SPRS scores, the top score is 110. The funny thing about SPRS is that the minimum score is negative 204 points. And the reason why is that some of the controls out of those 110 are weighted more heavily than others. So if you can't prove that you're doing a control, it could actually subtract points between 1 and 5 points off of your score. And there's 44 controls that are worth 5 points. Now, 17 of those are based on CMMC level 1 or FAR 52-204-21. That's really the same set of controls CMMC level 1 uses. The other controls that are worth 5 points are around preventing exploitation of the network and the information stored on that network. So our recommendation is that you make sure you have those 44 5-pointers done, just get those done first, right? Any other controls where you have a potential control deficiency, you can cover those right now through plans of action and milestones. And that's also a fairly familiar action, right? Under DFARS, we were allowed to have POAMs. The difference is that under CMMC level 2, when CMMC level 2 goes live, you have 6 months to close POAMs. You aren't allowed to have POAMs on an ongoing basis. So, and I'll talk to that in a bit more in a moment here. But if you're ahead on your 44 5-pointers, move to your 3-pointers and then move to the 1-pointers. And if you're looking at this going, wait, there's an eye chart there, how do I know which ones are here? Check the published DOD assessment methodology document. That'll actually provide the specific point values associated with each one of these controls. The other thing that you'll have, and you'll already have, is you'll have a system security plan, right? An SSP. If you previously submitted data to SPRS, you would have found quickly that if you don't have an SSP, you'd have a score of 0. But you also need to have other documents too, right? And this is part of CMMC 2.0. You actually need to have policies explaining at a very high level how your organization stands on cybersecurity, as well as procedures for how you perform those activities consistently. Now, for several years, we've been, I think industry has collectively been really less enthused about the application of NIST 800-171 to corporate settings. They make sense in a governmental setting or in a federal setting because they're designed to protect controlled unclassified information, CUI. But if you've got a mixed commercial, federal business, some of these are going to seem just completely out of place to your normal business users. So consider, for example, a control that says you have to do periodic assessments of the risk to organizational operations, organizational assets resulting from the operation of organizational systems and processing, storage, and transmission of CUI. A lot of business users are going to look at that and go, what is CUI precisely? Why do I need to worry about this thing? Because most commercial businesses that don't do work with the federal government and don't do work with the Department of Defense, they just don't have any CUI. And so the idea of a periodic risk assessment associated with CUI is going to seem out of place. Or let's say you had to have a control that said you had to label media that contains CUI and maintain accountability of it when it's being transported outside of your controlled areas. If you don't have a lot of users that handle a lot of CUI on a daily basis, that concept is going to really feel foreign, and they're going to feel confused and not know, like, how do I do this? How do I behave in a new way? And this is why we really recommend that enclave dedicated for your CUI. There are just a lot of controls in CMMC level 2, which again, that's just NIST 800-171 for purposes of our conversation. And those controls don't really scale well in a mixed commercial federal business. So again, that enclave, that logical fence we're going to put around our CUI and around our systems that store, process, and transmit CUI, that's going to help limit who can access it, and it's going to actually make it easier for our business to adopt CMMC level 2. And in general, there's a flow chart shown on screen here. If a system that stores or processes or transmits CUI, or there's a system moving just one over, right? If it provides security functions for CUI, those are going to be assets that are considered to be in scope of your assessment. And you're going to need to have CMMC specific policies as well as standards as procedures associated with those systems. And you'd have those systems defined in your SSP, your system security plan. Those items that would be out of scope, moving over to the right, the blue, those items that are out of scope or that are in scope, but where CMMC controls aren't applicable, those are going to refer to your enterprise-wide policies, standards, and procedures. And that can also include contractors. So if you've got a sub that's working with you, they'd need to have their own policies and standards and procedures. So one of those considerations we can make is, does your business need to have one enclave or two enclaves or more enclaves? If you've got a really clear separation of duties boundary for people who could access FCI or CUI, you could have two separate enclaves, one for FCI, one for CUI. But also, if you've got two separate programs you're supporting, each one is processing CUI, maybe you're doing one for the Navy and maybe you're doing one for the Air Force, just at a very simple level, and you're processing CUI, you can actually have an enclave specific to that system, to that program for that end customer that you'd have aligned and have all of the assets in scope limited to that sole enclave. The advantage there, of course, that's pretty reasonable cybersecurity because you're ensuring that only people who need access to those data have access to those data, and you've got good security controls being applied there, but you're not applying them out to the entire organization. If you're working on that fictional Air Force program or on that fictional Navy program, you're going to have more security controls that you work with as an employee. And if you're just in the general commercial field, if you're not working on one of those two programs, you won't have some of those controls applied to you. And the intent here is really to limit access to CUI, and that's really the underpinning point of CMMC level 2. But the other advantage of enclaves is that it's limiting the amount of changes our broad user population has to go through. So if most of your end users don't need access to CUI, they don't get access to the enclave. And as such, if there's a business process change for maybe how you process a contract or how you send an email or how you communicate internally, right? If you're not handling CUI, if you're not associated with that program, any business process changes, any technology changes, you are completely shielded from. And that really makes it easier to minimize the amount of change that our end users go through, and also the amount of training we have to produce for our end users that are in those environments that process or store or transmit CUI. So the advantage of that enclave there is it makes your approach very defensible, but your business processes for how you're going to conduct projects need to change, right? Those that actually need to change if you don't have an enclave, right? If you decide, hey, we're just going to apply these controls to the entire organization, CMMC level 2 specifically requires you've got controls for CUI and FCI, right? So if you're applying this to your whole organization or just a subset, you still do have to apply it. One of those ones that we see is problematic is around data spillage. And that's where CUI is transmitted either accidentally or unintentionally out of an enclave in an insecure manner or to an unauthorized party. Now that might sound really technical, but if you take a document that's labeled CUI and you send it by email, you've got data spillage right there, right? That's a pretty common scenario. And so when we're thinking about building policies and procedures around CMMC level 2, we really want to think through organizational change management so that your affected end user population understands, how do we do these new business processes so that they aren't picking up documents that are labeled CUI and sending them off by email, because that's just going to cause all kinds of downstream mitigations for your business to have to do. Once you've done that several times, you go, wow, we need a process for sending emails now, or a process for sending CUI around. Better to plan for that than to deal with the fallout as a consequence of it happening. So in addition to the number of controls, those 110 controls that are in scope, and the additional requirements around storage and processing and transmission of CUI, the other thing that's interesting on CMMC level 2 is there's a bifurcated assessment type, depending on the information in your project. And I think probably before November 2021, bifurcated was not a word people used in common parlance. I don't think anybody really had that as the new hotness for 2021, 2022, but now bifurcated really is the word. And so if you are, as I wait for the slide to advance there, so if the project you're working on is going to be CMMC level 2, but it's not critical to national security, your organization is going to be able to do a self-assessment. And that's much like we are doing today with SPURS submissions. Now, again, that needs to be submitted with a senior company official. And again, we're still waiting to determine what is a senior company official specifically. But if you're making let's say you're making an assembly. So you've got a diagram or you've got a schematic and it's labeled CUI, you're going to be CMMC level 2 right there. And when you're conducting your self-assessment, right, again, use NIST 800-171A, but do that before you go into SPURS, right? And just keep in mind that if your organization isn't meeting all the determination statements associated with each assessment objective, you can't mark it as met in SPURS. But if your project is deemed critical to national security, and that phrase, critical to national security, is actually called out in CMMC level 2. You'd need to have a certified third-party assessment organization conduct your assessment. Now that's a commercial entity. And if you've ever been through a, I don't know, I guess like a SOC 2 type 2, or if you've ever been through a SOX audit, you're gonna recognize the general stance and motion that are involved here. There were some limited assessments that were conducted under CMMC 1.0. Those were about 6 to 8 week assessments, and they were quite thorough. On a positive note, if you are working on a project that's critical to national security and on that bifurcated CMMC level 2, you only have to do the external assessment every 3 years for the life of your project. This also leads to an interesting question. If you were previously working on a CMMC level 2 non-bifurcated, like not critical to national security, and then you move up and you bid on and you win a contract that is critical to national security, you can expect when you have an external assessor, I've spoken to a couple external assessors now, they're going to ask for the written results of your CMMC level 1 self-assessment, as well as the CMMC level 2 self-assessment. And the reason they're going to do that is it's going to be a lot more efficient for them, as opposed to them having to start over from scratch. They're going to say, okay, well, you've already done this before. What did you come up with? What are those elements that they want to focus in on, and what are those elements that they want to review? So you'll be handing them your written documentation in whatever form it happens to be. Only other thing we can say about certified third-party assessment organizations right now, they're going to use NIST 800-171A for their assessments too, right? And they're going to use the same DOD assessment methodology for scoring the effectiveness of your controls. I guess the only final note on this one, the thing we know on CMMC level 3 right now, if you find yourself on a CMMC level 3 project, you'll have the DIBCAC do your assessment. Everything we've heard of them is that they are very fair and they are very thorough. So if you're on CMMC level 3, expect that you're going to have a very thorough assessment conducted by DIBCAC. So the DoD, though, really, that determination of if a project is critical to national security or not, that's the DoD. They have the final say on that, and that's part of the contracting process. Now, that also could happen if you're a sub and you're working with a prime. You could see that through a contract flow down from a prime to a sub. It's entirely feasible that a prime that has a CMMC level 2 bifurcated contract that's critical to national security is going to rather flow down work that isn't critical to national security, because that, first of all, that opens up the field for them for who can bid on it. The other requirement there is a sub only needs to have that annual self-assessment performed. So that's kind of CMMC level 1 and CMMC level 2. Let's talk about the timeline associated with CMMC level 2. So you may have been watching the presentation so far and said, oh geez, that's a lot of work. He's talking about setting up enclaves, he's talking about segmentation, he's talking about business process changes, he's talking about 110 controls. That doesn't sound like a good time. There's probably a lot of work here. CMMC 2.0 actually is accounting for that in a couple of ways. So the first way is through plans of action and milestones. So if your organization right now has a score of less than 110 in SPURS, right now, actually, you've already filed POAMs. So, and under DFARS, we are allowed to have POAMs and just extend them. The difference is when CMMC level 2 comes into place, you have 6 months to resolve control deficiencies via a POAM, a plan of action and milestone, right? You've got 6 months to get it done. The wrinkle there is that those 44 5-pointer controls in SPURS, it's really unlikely the Department of Defense is going to accept a POAM on one of those. And once that's in common practice, we're going to know for absolute sure. But right now, everything we're hearing is that you won't be able to file a POAM on those 44 controls. And if you do file a POAM on a control, you have 180 days to resolve it, because they're not going to permit renewals of POAMs. The other significant change, this is called out in CMMC level 2, you can apply for a waiver. I wouldn't recommend this as a strategy. It's intended for mission critical programs, and it's also considered to be a last resort opposed to a POAM. I say that's a last resort because it requires senior DoD approvals. That's plural. And that's going to be pretty hard to justify, and it's going to be pretty hard to obtain. I wouldn't gamble a program on this one. And even if you were to get a waiver, as opposed to a POAM, it's still only time boxed to 6 months. So we're recommending that clients just avoid the waiver strategy. We don't think that's viable for most businesses to pursue. So in terms of the CMMC's timeline, if you were following CMMC level 1, there was a statement that all contracts had to be compliant with CMMC level 1 by 2026, right? They hit the pause button on that schedule when they announced CMMC level 2. Specifically, where we're at right now, CMMC level 2 needs to go through 2 public processes for comment, Title 32 and Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So when CMMC level 2 came out in November of last year, the DoD estimated rulemaking would take 9 to 24 months. That's a good thing, actually, if you think about it. It means we've got some runway here. So if you've got control deficiencies, if you know your SPURS score is less than 110, and you've already got POAMs, keep working those POAMs, right? Keep working those down, because we've got between, let's say, late summer of this year, which I doubt, and November 2023 to address any control deficiencies and establish any enclaves if you need to for FCI or CUI before November 2023. So if you see anything like this out on the internet as well, on a published timeline that looks like this, it's no longer valid. And there is really a lot of material out on the internet that still refers to CMMC level 1 and a timeline that's really no longer true. So right now, the horizon to keep in mind is somewhere between, let's call it early fall this year, and November 2023 is when CMMC level 2 is going to be fully in effect. But as we think about that, the other thing, when the DOD has been on webinars and has been speaking publicly on this one, I think it was Jesse Salazar, came out and said, he hoped nobody was waiting on the CMMC level 2 requirements to improve cybersecurity. And it's really a great point, actually. Cybersecurity is a pretty regular topic in the news these days. It's not just in limited industry publications, but it's actually part of our national conversation at this point. And criminal threat actors, as well as nation states, have really got like all the reasons to want to steal your intellectual property. And we know this because it's cheaper to steal a process than it is to invent a process. And it's cheaper to manufacture a nearly identical product than to go design one. And that's just kind of an unfortunate commercial reality. That's part of why the CMMC exists in the first place, because right now there's entire like aerospace systems that are being manufactured today overseas that are near duplicates of systems that were designed at substantial cost by domestic companies. The other risk is to these guys, right? To our warfighters. They've got some pretty substantial risks in their day jobs. And some of us may remember the Target breach, for example, from some years ago, where the threat actor was able to steal some credit card information. And the way they did it was they compromised an HVAC vendor. Now, at the time, the press didn't have the term supply chain attack, which we keep hearing about these days, but that's what that was. That was a supply chain attack. So now I want you to consider today, let's say a threat actor breaches a system that you've manufactured. They might actually be able to move laterally and cause a lot more damage than just stolen credit cards. That's really what's at stake here, particularly for connected systems that are in that bifurcated CMMC level 2 projects that are critical to national defense. So really, this isn't a good time to tap the brakes. We know CMMC level 2 is coming, right? We might have got a year or two breather, but the threat actors were never going to wait for that date, right? If you know your organization handles CUI, you've got a little more breathing room to implement 110 controls and to build out an enclave if that's the best strategy for your business, but you don't have unlimited time. Your company's going to be in a far better place competitively and from a security perspective if you start building a plan now rather than hoping to get a waiver or plan of action milestone document, because again, those are becoming time limited. So really, now's the time to start closing your existing POAMs, to revisit your self-assessment score using the determination statements in NIST 800-171A. And by doing that, your organization is going to be prepared for any future updates to NIST 800-171, as well as the final version of CMMC after the rulemaking is finished. So at the start of our presentation, we talked about kind of the level of uncertainty due to how new CMMC level 2 is. And that for the businesses to remain competitive in this environment, you really need to be certain of upcoming regulatory changes. So we talked about how to change your strategies in advance of CMMC level 2 so that you're able to navigate this period of uncertainty and be well prepared to defend against modern cyber threats. I know we went pretty quick. We've got about 20 minutes on the clock for questions and answers. Jason, I think you've been moderating the chat. What do we have for questions?
No questions in the chat as of yet, but I'm gonna kick them off if that's all right for you, Kane.
So that's fine with me.
The first question I have for you is, I know you mentioned a lot about I should look to my contracts for whether I'm FCI or CUI. We've had our contract in this situation. We've had our contract for a while. We've looked in the contracts. I can't really see what I'm supposed to be looking for. Who can I call or who can I contact to figure out, how do I determine which one of these is it specific to my contract? Is there a general point of contact? Can you give us a guidance?
So this is a good question for your counsel. I hope that they are internal or external counsel, depending. But whoever's reviewing your contracts should have been looking for the FAR clause, like 52, 204, 21. That's usually the one that slips in there, and that requires a minimum of CMMC level 1, or the DFARS clause, the interim clause as well. Essentially, there are a number of keywords you can flag on in your contracts that say, okay, this is a requirement. That's one way of knowing. A second way of knowing, and it might be a little bit easier actually, if you know that you're producing assemblies for the Navy, yeah, you've got GUI. Even if they're not labeling it as GUI, if they're sending you assembly schematics, you can go, okay, common sense test here. I got a thing that shows how to make an assembly. This is GUI because of who sent it to you. That's another way that you can do it. The other thing that I'd encourage is all of this is on the public register for what the specific terms are that you'd go look for. If you were to do a search for, I don't know, start with FAR 52204-21, you're going to find pretty quickly on the internet a list of all of the related contractual flowdowns that would be associated with that. Then you could go search through your contracts. But again, probably the easiest people to ask, go ask your general counsel or your external counsel for help on that one, or figure out like, what do we make? What are we doing? If we know we've got a governmental contract, that you know you've got FCI. If you know you're getting assemblies or schematics or something that shows how to build a thing, you've probably got CUI.
Excellent. Thanks. I have another one.
Sure.
You talked a lot about enclave making, which that does sound like a lot of work. Has Cmmc or anybody in any of your research or conversations talked about leveraging GovCloud in order to make that enclave a little bit easier?
Yes. So Microsoft has also come out on this one for Microsoft's government cloud, though there are other government cloud providers. Just speaking specific to Microsoft, they've got a really good public blog section around compliance where they extensively cover the topic. In general, the things where cloud providers get in trouble. First one, if you wanted to use like a cloud to build your enclave, the first thing you want them to be FedRAMP moderate. That's something that has come out consistently. You have to make sure that they are FedRAMP moderate. If they're FedRAMP low, do not bother talking to them. If you talk to your cloud vendor and they go FedRAMP wet, again, you want to go find a different cloud vendor to go speak with. So that's the first big requirement there. The second big requirement associated with a governmental cloud like Microsoft's GCC High, you want to make sure that all of those data are being accessed only by US people, so US persons. That's a requirement that's kind of buried in the rulemaking associated with this. But most that are FedRAMP High are going to also have the CONUS and no foreign requirements built in. Sorry, no foreign nationals allowed to have access to those data. That's an underpinning one. So again, looking for FedRAMP moderate is going to be pretty good. Beyond that, where it gets interesting is a question of if we set up entirely new computers in GCC High, Microsoft's government cloud, for example, and if we had, let's say we had an ERP system that used to have government contracts and other information, it seems to be considered acceptable that if you take the government contract out of your ERP system, move it up to GCC High, whatever you're storing it in there, and just put a link from the ERP system, a hyperlink or maybe breadcrumbs or explanation of how to go find the document that went missing, provided it's no longer stored on the non-governmental ERP system, but it's stored in the GovCloud. Even if there's a hyperlink, that's okay, because it's being stored in an appropriate location, and presumably not everybody who is able to click that link would be able to access that underpinning resource. The only other thing we've seen right now that's a bit spicy is around virtualization and virtual desktop environments. There's two schools of thought on this one right now. The Department of Defense has not come out hard and said one way or the other, but the idea is you could have a virtual desktop environment where somebody goes to their normal corporate computer, fires up a virtual desktop client, and is able to connect into that government cloud environment. And this means they don't have to have two physical devices. Provided you can show that you've disabled the ability of that end user to copy files out of that virtual desktop environment, to copy the clipboard out of that environment, to connect like a USB drive to that remote network environment, like provided you've got that in documented, and provided that you can prove it if you have a certified third-party assessment organization show up. In general, it's believed that's okay. I can't say for certain because there have been some rumblings that the DOD is still not like 100% on that one. Myself, I'm in favor of it because otherwise everybody has to have two laptops, right? And you do the old share pivot that we used to do back in the programs where you'd have like your laptop that was typically GFE, government furnished equipment, and that's how you get into the system, and you weren't allowed to, you had two. It was annoying. I'm hoping we're past those days, and it seems that's where things are, but if you go that route of using virtualization on a government cloud, or maybe you had hosted your own cloud, on your own data center, just make sure that you can prove that you have controls limiting that there can't be any data leakage out of that GovCloud environment. Sorry if that was a bit technical.
No, that was great. I do have a couple more. One of them was about, came through the chat window here. So does IoT and OT equipment apply CMMC controls in the equipment itself?
Let me go back to my, oops, not that one. Let me go back to the flow chart because IoT and OT are actually called out on that flow chart I built. They were on the right-hand side. There. Seeing the whole presentation in reverse. There, all right. So OT and IoT, and this is straight out of CMMC level 2. Looking at that fourth column, is the system an IoT or OT device, test equipment, GFE, or a restricted information system? It's considered at that point to be a specialized asset. So it would be in scope of the assessment, but it's the CMMC controls aren't considered to be applicable to that. So if you've got a, I don't know, let's think about this for a second. Let's say you've got an OT sensor that's been deployed. There's probably no way you can apply a lot of the controls to it. So when they wrote CMMC level 2, they went, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Let's not, like, it'll be in the scope of the assessment. It'll be noted that it's in the environment. It's part of the system, but CMMC controls aren't going to be considered applicable. Common sense, of course, is going to apply here. If you've got a system where people are, you've got the room, it's not a skiff, but it's, where you've got your system where you're doing CUI work, you probably don't want to drop an Amazon Alexa in there, right? That's just common sense. You'd go, yeah, because the assessor is going to look at that and go, seems strange. Alexa, please leak my secrets to like Amazon. Not to throw shade on Amazon, but you wouldn't want to have devices that were consumer grade just lurking around, as those would probably be flagged as a point of interest. Next question, unless there's a follow-up on that one.
I got a couple more here. So we're not a Fortune 1000 company, and as a strategy, we've set out to manage, have a managed service provider do a good chunk of our IT support. Can I continue to use that managed service provider? What types of things do I need to ask? Or do I need to look for another one who's already bringing forward some of the CMMC capabilities?
So it's actually an interesting question here, and this flow chart is material to this conversation. So if a MSSP or an MSP, managed security services provider, managed services provider, if they have access to the system that's defined in your SSP, your system security plan, that stores, processes, or transmits CUI, they are effectively part of the system. At that point, that means they are part of your self-assessment. So everything there that's around either contractor risk managed assets that would be in scope with CMMC controls aren't applicable. That's going to be some of their assets that don't have access to the system. But if they're, say, providing, let's say antivirus, right? Let's say they've got antivirus, anti-malware, some kind of endpoint detection and response solution that's in your system that stores, processes, or transmits CUI. If you are not on the bifurcated side of CMMC level 2, as part of your self-assessment, you are going to need to assess, and they are going to need to participate in that self-assessment of their security, of their policies and procedures, standards and guidelines, and also the controls, those 110 controls applicable to their part of the infrastructure that they're managing for you. If you're on the bifurcated side, critical to national security, right? Most MSSPs in that space are going to need to have an independent certified third-party assessment organization come in and do a full paid assessment of their security. And that's going to make for a really interesting motion because ideally an MSSP that attains CMMC level 2 bifurcated for national security, projects for national security, that's functionally a competitive advantage for those vendors. It remains to be seen, because this is still kind of new, like how that's going to be used. Under CMMC level 1, organizations were not permitted to announce that they had a given CMMC level, like you couldn't use it for marketing. I'm not sure where the rulemaking is going to fall out on that one on CMMC level 2, but I knew, like, if I wanted to go shopping for an MSSP right now, and I knew that I handled CUI, part of my conversation would be, so CMMC level 2, yeah? Where are you at on that? How you doing? Are you going to be able to manage this, yes or no? And if they give you a blank stare or they get a bit shouty, that might be a time to go looking for another managed security services provider. If on the other hand they go, yeah, actually we've been tracking that, we're building that, it's all good. Easy day, right? Happy, keep happy with them.
Perfect. All right, I have two more here, just to make sure that we fit them all in time. So can the prime decide to bifurcate, or is that exclusively controlled by the government contract?
It'll be via the flow down. We anticipate that primes are going to, like the prime would have won the bifurcated CMMC level 2 critical to national defense. Via the flow downs that you sign, that's going to define what you get. So they might say you only to bid on this need CMMC level 1. So they're just going to send you the cut sheets and a contract for the cut sheets. They're not actually going to send you assemblies or anything interesting. They're not going to send you schematics to go build. That would be an easy way for them to manage their risk and also to have a larger pool to draw from. We think that beyond that, usual rules are going to apply. So even if you find yourself on a project and the prime sends you a thing and you think that you probably shouldn't have it, that's one where you go back to the prime and say, hey, this looks like the schematic for an F-35. Can you tell us if this is CUI, right? Or CUI? And if that doesn't work, or if you're worried about how the prime is conducting flow downs on the data that you're receiving, that goes to the government contract officer at that point, right? Hopefully you don't have to go there. Nobody wants to have that conversation about, hey, the prime is playing fast and loose with their data. But that would be your other recourse at that point.
All right. Thanks. A couple more, one more dropped in. So how does CMMC apply to Scada systems that are logging data from equipment that is running processes? This is probably very related to the chart you have in your.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking they're in scope of the assessment, but because of the nature of the equipment, CMMC controls wouldn't be considered to be applicable for them. You'd still want to have policies associated with them. And where it might be interesting to explore is how assessors are going to say, okay, so you've got a Scada system that's logging stuff. Where are those logs being written? How are those logs being written? And it would be really hard for those logs to be considered CUI. And I say that because there's an analogy that's being talked about right now in the industry where security logs that are being sent to a SIM, a security incident event monitor, those aren't considered to be CUI. Like log data themselves probably aren't CUI, and so you don't need to apply those same level of controls. The things that control access into those systems that can monitor those logs, that's where the controls tend to get applied.
Is there data on implementation cost based on the size of a company to get to level 2?
Not yet. Not yet. Not that I'd say is trustworthy. There are, this is one where it really, the DOD believes that this should be affordable for all businesses. And part of the way that they were talking about it in CMMC level 1 was that we could, just as subs or as primes, that we could actually charge the DOD for this. It turns out under CMMC level 2, they just expect that you're going to roll this into your cost. So if you know, for example, that it's costing you $10,000 to get to CMMC level 1, just for storage, processing, and transmission of FCI, and I threw out 10K just because it's a round number, that means that you'd probably build that uplift into your contract cost. Beyond that, because it's so new, there really isn't a lot. Obviously, if you're standing up entirely new hardware, entirely new software, or an entirely new cloud environment, yeah, it's going to cost money. There's just no way around that. Obviously, negotiate as hard as you can for discounts, and then roll that cost back into whatever you're charging your subs, or charging the prime, or charging directly to the department.
Excellent. Here's maybe a metaphysical one, but I do want to toss it over to you to discuss it a little bit. So in our industry, a lot of the contracts are government, and we're looking to break in. You talked about how I couldn't use my CMMC, really as marketing, broadly, but we're trying to break into upper level contracts. By us aligning to the 171, is that going to slow the rest of our business down, or is that still just general security processes that would be appropriate?
If you're only working in the government space, and that's like your sole space that you're selling into, if that is your target market, I would be running hard at NIST 800-171 and CMMC level 2, because those are functionally the same document for right now, just the numbering difference. And the reason why is because it's going to be a requirement eventually when you win a contract that has CMMC level 2 requirements built into it. So yeah, I'd say just like everybody buckle up, get yourself a good organizational change management person, get yourself a good training person, start thinking through some of the business process changes that are going to need to be made associated with common things like how do you process contracts, or how do you handle emails, or how do you conduct telecommunications, like do you do it on calls, or do you do it on Teams, or how do you handle those things? Those all seem like little minor, like everyday stuff. That's what trips people up more than anything else in this space. It's the common stuff that you take for granted that just always works, that once you move into an exclusively working with the government, that's where you have to look at those processes and say, okay, does this still work? Does this comply with how it's intended to work under NIST 800-171 and NIST 800-171A? But yeah, if that's your prime contract, go for that. And once you finish NIST 800-171, bonus points, go for NIST 800-172. And I say that because CMMC level 3 is going to be based on NIST 800-172. That formal mapping has not yet been announced, but that's the word, is that it's just going to be NIST 800-172, or at least a subset of it.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Keen. Those are all our questions and my questions.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank everybody for submitting such great questions as part of this. That's enjoyable. I think we've got like 2 minutes left. Kelly, I think we're pretty much finished out here, yeah?
Yeah, Kelly had to step out for a second, unfortunately, but yeah, we're finished up. That's all the questions. Thank you both for coming and being a part of this for us.
You're welcome. And if you've got any other questions that came out, just check out our website, meetassent.com. We'll be happy to take those questions by our email as well after the presentation ends. If you have one that comes up, just drop us an email, let us know.
Okay. thank you all. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good day.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.